Every story has to begin somewhere, and an author's role is to drop a pin somewhere on the map of history and say, here's the beginning. So for the story of the Metroidvania subgenre, we're going to begin with 1977's PC classic Zork. On its surface, Zork bears almost exactly zero resemblance to the kind of game that tends to show up under the Metroidvania header. It involves no platform jumping, no real combat, no action at all, in fact. You don't kill monsters to gain levels, and you don't equip progressively better gear to strengthen your protagonist. Basically, none of the features that go into the word Metroidvania have any place here. That is, with one exception. And that lone exception sits at the very core of the Metroidvania concept, more so than the 2D barrel hopping of Donkey Kong or the shooty platform action of Ghosts and Goblins. So what is Zork anyway? It's an adventure game, a text-driven journey into an underground empire that sees you wandering through the caverns, banded to time by all but a handful of monsters and one rather persistent thief. Although Zork plays out as what we know today as a text-adventure game, at the time of its inception, there was no such designation or genre. Its creators, a group of computer programmers from MIT, actually set out to create a video role-playing game. What set Zork apart from most early computer RPGs has to do with its creators' focus. Most RPGs revolve around the statistical elements of role-playing. After all, the RPG Dungeons & Dragons evolved from miniature wargames a la Warhammer. And computers, they're really good at numbers. A random number generator is just as good as dice, if not more so. And it's so much less trouble to program all those complex conditional rules and combat modifiers than it is to commit them to memory. Numbers are only half the RPG experience, maybe less than that really if you want to get to the heart of what role-playing is all about. A great RPG session is about storytelling, of a born narrator who leads a group of friends through an intricately constructed tale. The problem with computers, though, is that they're not very flexible. What happens when your party wanders off in a weird direction the game master never accounted for? A talented GM will improvise and come up with something new. A computer will just give an error message and force you back on track. Zork's authors, that is Bruce Daniels, Dave Lebling, Mark Blank, and Tim Anderson, aimed to solve that question by creating an interactive text parser that could divine a player's intent and respond with natural language. Of course, what they came up with was a matter of simple conditional statements, but it felt convincing enough at the time. Zork was no ELYSSES, but it was sarcastic, descriptive, and adaptive. It painted pictures with words, gave players enticing clues, and let them figure out the world around them. It could remember what players had acquired, what they had done in the world, and what challenges they'd overcome. And if the player said something improper, it would respond with a chiding or even mocking response. However, it's the world of Zork that matters most for our purposes. While Zork plays nothing at all like a Metroidvania game in the 2D action platformer sense, what those four geniuses at MIT created here was, for all intents and purposes, gaming's first non-linear persistent world, in which player progression was gated by exploration and the application of tools. The workings of Zork don't exactly map onto something like Symphony of the Night. Some obstacles in the world work more as riddles than as tests of how effectively you've gathered equipment and can put them to use. For instance, no item will allow you to bypass the Cyclops. Instead, you simply need to figure out, somehow, that you need to say Ulysses to get past him. But in other areas, you simply need to figure out how the items you've collected in the course of your wandering can be put to use to grant you access to new places. Need to descend a high, steep rise? Maybe that rope will do the trick. Need to get down a river? Well, you may have found a pump and a pile of plastic. What happens if you combine the two? And doesn't that shovel seem like it would be good for digging in the sand in this desert area? Where Zork works best is where it combines puzzle solving with your inventory. Like any good adventure game, really. Can't figure out how to open the locked treasure egg without shattering it? Perhaps you should give it to someone who might be good at picking locks. Like most games of its vintage, Zork does rely somewhat on unintuitive solutions and sometimes even pure guesswork. Particularly annoying is the thief, whom you need for certain solutions, but who has the potential to completely ruin your game if he randomly steals the wrong item or manages to randomly survive your confrontation with him. But those are the breaks with pioneering works. Zork's fundamental innovations made it one of the most influential games of all time. Even people who have never even heard of the game today draw on the concepts and mechanics it helped inspire. Of course, Zork had its own predecessors. Besides D&D, there was also William Crowther's Colossal Cave Adventure, aka Advent.
She's got a real attitude problem.
Oh, also, I'm taking over Steve's job.
See what I mean?
How would you know which programmers to keep? Do you even know their names?
Hey! Coder monkeys, come here. How many of you got sucked into adventure last night?
I knew it. She's sabotaging the project, Joe.
Okay, just curious. How many of you figured out what order to push the buttons in at the dam? And how many of you got out of the cave by breaking the code?
I had to get home to feed my cat.
Zork's creators drew heavily on that game's cavernous structures and text-based parser when creating their work at MIT. Still, Zork is where I've chosen to draw the line in the sand, simply because its contiguous world was so much more intricate and persistent than Advent's. Solving Zork relied far more on player ingenuity and the creative application of tools and equipment than anything that had come before it. And there was even that meager little bit of combat which involved knowing your opponent's weak point, namely greed. While limited in many ways and by no means an action-adventure game, Zork introduced to the medium a number of fundamental concepts that would become integral to the oddball little subgenre we call Metroidvania. And that's awesome. For more on this little subgenre of video games, backtrack over to Metroidvania.com.